Hey guys, tonight we step into the dust blue edge of ancient Mesopotamia, where the first city lights are really just oil lamps flickering against mud brick walls, and where damp clay tablets wait in neat stacks like the world's oldest inbox. You can almost feel the river air on your skin, hear sandals scrape courtyards before sunrise, and smell barley mash, wet reeds, and smoke curling from temple ovens. Our subject tonight is a calm but intriguing one: how Sumerian tablets may hint at a world where human roles were not just practical jobs, but part of a larger story about order, duty, and meaning. Some parts are widely accepted, history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination? Historians debate plenty here, and that is part of the charm. You probably would not survive this without complaining at least once, mostly because there is no coffee machine, no air conditioning, and absolutely no chance of filing a polite HR note against your local priest king. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, post your location and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive in imagination, at least at daybreak, in one of the great Sumerian city-states. Perhaps Uruk, perhaps Lagash, perhaps a place whose name survives because someone pressed it into clay 4,000 years ago, and the earth, by some miracle of dryness and luck, decided to keep it. Most historians agree that southern Mesopotamia gave rise to some of the earliest urban societies on Earth, and archaeology suggests these cities depended on careful systems of labour. Canals have to be dredged, fields have to be planted, grain has to be counted, sheep have to be sheared. Someone has to keep track of who owes what to whom, which means someone very early on gets stuck with paperwork. Humanity invents civilization and somehow still cannot escape administration. That may be the most ancient joke of all. What's broadly accepted is that these early cities are not loose collections of huts, but organised communities tied to temples, storehouses, workshops and fields. The evidence we do have points to a world where work is already divided. Not everybody does everything. Some people farm, some herd animals, some shape bricks, some weave textiles, some haul baskets, some manage rations. A few learn to read and write the wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform. If you are lucky, your hands smell like cedar oil and clean clay. If you are less lucky, your feet are planted in irrigation mud, while the sun starts making ambitious threats before breakfast. And yet, almost as soon as you look at the practical side, the larger idea begins to shimmer behind it. Sumerian and later Mesopotamian texts do not describe society as random. They often place human activity inside a sacred order. Gods are linked to cities, to temples, to kingship, to fertility, to storms, to wisdom, to grain, to the smooth functioning of everything that keeps panic from taking over by noon. One interpretation is that when people read these tablets, especially myths and hymns, they begin to see ordinary work as part of something bigger than survival. A careful reading might suggest that labour is not only necessary, it is meaningful because it belongs inside a universe arranged by divine powers. That does not mean a tablet comes along and says, in modern language, you are now officially assigned to become a junior regional barley logistics associate. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The tablets do not hand us a neat chart of modern careers stamped by the gods. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and the evidence is thinner than people on the internet sometimes pretend. What we do find is subtler. We find a culture in which order matters deeply, and in which social roles can be explained through stories that connect heaven and earth. Historians still argue whether these myths reflect daily life directly, or whether they are more like sacred poetry layered over real economic systems. That debate matters. If the myths simply mirror life, then they tell us how people understood the world they already had. If they help shape life, then they may have encouraged people to accept social roles as natural, maybe even ordained. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. One of the strongest mainstream anchors is the temple economy. Archaeology suggests temples in early Mesopotamia were not just places of prayer. They were major institutions that managed land labour, storage and redistribution. In plain English, the temple could feel a little bit like church, city hall, bank, warehouse, and regional headquarters rolled into one mud brick complex with better incense. If you live in that world, your job is not floating freely in some modern fantasy of personal branding. Your work is woven into a system. You belong to a household, a workshop, a field team, a herd group, a building crew, or a scribal school. You are placed. And once placement becomes ordinary, imagination gets to work. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if later readers, hearing that God's established order, begin to imagine that the divisions within society were not just useful, but intended from the beginning? This is where the mystery deepens without needing to run off the rails. A more cautious explanation could be that sacred language made social structure easier to live with. If your labour is part of cosmic balance, then your exhaustion has meaning. If your city's goddess watches over the storehouses, then ration counts feel less like dry math and more like ritual order. It is possible that belief did not erase hardship, but gave it a frame. There is also, of course, a fringe idea. A fringe idea proposes that the gods in Mesopotamian texts were remembered as literal beings who engineered humanity into specific types, dividing people into roles that echo right into modern society. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it lingers because ancient myths do sometimes describe humans as created for service. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less a hard claim and more a haunting question. Why do so many old stories imagine people as made for tasks? Why does labour appear so close to creation itself? Even if the answer is purely cultural, it is still fascinating. Human beings may have been trying from the very beginning to explain why life feels like a long list of assigned duties with occasional snacks. You can picture the scene now with a little more texture. Dawn crawls over the flat roofs. A potter turns his wheel. A woman at a loom tightens threads with practised fingers. A field worker shoulders a tool polished by other hands before his. A temple servant opens a storeroom. A scribe presses signs into clay, probably feeling very important, which, to be fair, he kind of is. Somewhere a child watches all this and learns not through lecture but through repetition that the world is already sorted. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And the solid ground tonight is this early Mesopotamian cities depended on division of labour. Sacred institutions helped organise daily life, and Sumerian texts often present order as something larger than human whim. One interpretation is that this helped people see roles not just as jobs, but as place identity, even fate. What if the first great urban civilization did not merely divide tasks, but taught generations to feel those divisions in their bones? That question settles over the city as the sun climbs higher and the clay begins to dry. Your sandals pick up dust. The reeds whisper by the canal. Somewhere a tablet is stacked with others, waiting thousands of years for someone to wonder what kind of world it came from, and why so many people in it seem to wake each morning already expected to become themselves. By now the morning has fully arrived, and the city is no longer stretching awake, but moving with purpose, the way a beehive might move if bees had account ledgers, tax burdens, and very strong opinions about barley. You follow the flow through a lane between mud brick walls where baskets brush past your hip, and someone mutters over a missing goat, as if the fate of civilization hangs on one animal with poor judgment. In a sense it does. Most historians agree that early Mesopotamian cities survived only through coordination. This is not a loose, dreamy village where everyone simply feels inspired and hopes dinner will sort itself out. Archaeology suggests the city works because people perform different tasks in relation to one another, and because those tasks are supported by an idea larger than any single person. That larger idea is order. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian religion does not place the gods far away in some abstract heaven. The divine is tied closely to fields, floods, walls, kingship, fertility, justice, and survival. Each city honours particular deities, and the life of the city is often imagined under their protection. The evidence we do have points to a culture in which sacred and practical life overlap so completely that trying to separate them can feel a little like trying to separate flour from bread after it has already been baked. One interpretation is that this overlap gave daily work a kind of sacred gravity. A careful reading might suggest that people did not merely labour in the presence of the gods, but inside a world already structured by them. You see it in the architecture before you see it in the tablets. The temple does not lurk at the edge of town like an optional weekend hobby. It rises within the life of the city as a centre of activity and meaning. Goods move through its courtyards. Workers are attached to its estates. Offerings are brought to it. Records are kept for it. The gods, in other words, are not decorative. They are woven into the logic of how the place understands itself. A more cautious explanation could be that religious language helped make collective systems legible. It is possible that when life becomes complicated, people explain its structure through stories that feel bigger and more stable than personal choice. And this is where the theme of roles begins to sharpen. If the city belongs to a god, if the temple organises labour, if the king rules by divine favour, then the ordinary person may begin to see his or her place, not just as economically useful, but cosmically fitted. That is not the same as saying every farmer receives a clay envelope from heaven marked career assignment. That's a possibility, not a certainty. And frankly, the heavenly mail service seems underdocumented. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts do not hand us a neat modern doctrine of personality types distributed by divine decree. But one interpretation is that the language of divine order made social function feel natural, maybe even inevitable. A hymn, a myth, a royal inscription, a temple record, each does something slightly different, but together they create atmosphere. They produce a world in which rank and task make sense because they belong to a larger pattern. You can feel that pattern in small details. The grain is measured, the offerings are timed, the festivals follow calendars, the canals must open and close with precision, even the stars are watched. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies were deeply attentive to sign cycles and categories. The same culture that tracks the heavens also tracks rations. That may sound unromantic, but it is strangely revealing. Heaven and inventory can live very close together. Historians still argue whether this sacred framing mostly reflected social realities that already existed, or whether it actively helped reinforce them. That debate matters because it changes the emotional texture of the world. If divine order is a mirror, then myths tell people what they are already doing. If divine order is a mould, then myths may help shape what people think they ought to do. The evidence is not neat enough to settle everything, which is probably good for all of us, because certainty would ruin the mystery and also deprive late-night history channels of a perfectly decent livelihood. Still, the clues are strong. In Mesopotamian thought, chaos is dangerous and order is precious. Floodwaters can ruin fields, drought can shrivel grain, enemies can breach walls, a failed harvest can turn philosophy into hunger very quickly. So when texts speak of divine arrangement, they may be doing more than praising the gods. They may be offering reassurance that the world is not random. One interpretation is that assigning meaning to roles help people endure uncertainty. If the baker bakes, the herder herds, the scribe writes, and the priest performs ritual, then the city holds together. What if the first real comfort of civilization was not freedom, but placement? That question feels both ancient and familiar. Even now, people often want to know what they are meant to do, where they fit, whether their work matters, whether there is some deeper reason they ended up in one role rather than another. The modern version comes with personality quizzes, office jargon, and suspiciously cheerful productivity podcasts. The ancient version comes with incense clay and the possibility that your city's patron goddess is monitoring the grain accounts. Different packaging, same anxiety. There is of course another layer that keeps drawing modern readers in. A popular rumour claims that the Mesopotamian gods were remembered as literal rulers who sorted humanity into useful categories, the way an estate manager sorts tools. This theory is not widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It relies heavily on speculative readings and often leaps past what the tablets actually say. But even without taking that leap, the underlying fascination remains understandable. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if these ancient texts preserve not proof of supernatural engineering, but an early human instinct to turn social structure into sacred narrative? That possibility is suggestive, not conclusive. Yet it fits something real about human communities. People rarely tolerate pure randomness for long. They build explanations. They attach duty to virtue. They connect hierarchy to heaven. They tell themselves that the pattern is all-wise and meaningful. In Sumer, that pattern may have taken especially durable form because writing itself helped preserve it. Once ideas about order are pressed into clay, dried in the sun and copied across generations, they gain weight. Not truth automatically, but authority. A wet-spoken thought can vanish. A hardened tablet can stare at you for millennia with all the confidence of a manager who has never once doubted a memo. So you keep walking through the city, and the city keeps showing you the same lesson from different angles. Nothing is floating loose. Every courtyard leads to another task. Every task belongs to a system. Every system lives under sacred language. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But already the idea is settling in. In this world, work is not merely what fills the day. It may also be what tells a person who they are allowed to be. And as you pass beneath the shadow of the temple wall with clay dust on your ankles, and the murmur of record keepers somewhere nearby, you begin to sense how powerful that idea could become once a civilization starts telling itself that order is not just convenient but holy. The temple wall throws a long strip of shade across the lane, and for a moment it feels like relief, the kind of cool patch your whole body notices before your mind does. You step through a broad entrance where workers are already moving in and out, with baskets, jars, bundles of reeds, and that very old expression people wear when the day has barely begun, and yet somehow the paperwork is already winning. What's broadly accepted is that temple households in early Mesopotamia were not just ritual centres. Archaeology suggests they controlled land, stored goods, directed labour, and redistributed resources in ways that helped entire cities function. If you want to understand how roles hardened into something close to identity, this is one of the first places to look. Inside, nothing feels random. That matters. You do not enter a dreamy, sacred zone floating above daily life. You enter a machine made of courtyards, storerooms, workshops, ledgers, ovens, livestock pens, and human beings who all seem to know where they are supposed to stand. Most historians agree that temples in Sumer and later Mesopotamia could act as powerful economic institutions. The evidence we do have points to organised systems for tracking grain, wool, beer, labour assignments and offerings. One interpretation is that the temple helped turn work into a visible social pattern. A careful reading might suggest that the more often people encountered labour through temple structures, the more natural it felt to see occupation as something built into the shape of the world. You can hear it before you fully understand it. The scratch of reed styluses, the thump of sacks hitting packed earth, the low complaint of animals, the splash of water from jars, the soft recitation of counts and names. There is a rhythm here, and it is not the rhythm of private ambition. It is the rhythm of allocation. Someone measures barley, someone checks incoming wool, someone directs women at looms, someone verifies rations for labourers, someone opens a sealed door and inspects what is inside. Someone somewhere is almost certainly pretending to know where a missing basket went. Civilization begins, and within minutes someone is already blaming inventory. Most historians agree that this kind of management is one reason writing became so important in Mesopotamia. Early tablets are often practical. They list amounts, commodities, workers' deliveries. Archaeology suggests cuneiform first flourished, not because people urgently wanted to write moody poetry about sunsets, but because large institutions needed records. The poetry came too thankfully, but accounting got there early, which is both humbling and extremely on brand for our species. A more cautious explanation could be that once labour is counted, tracked and attached to institutions, it becomes easier to define people by function. Not always, not absolutely, but often enough to matter. That is where the temple's deeper influence may come in. A worker attached to temple estates is not just a person doing a task on a random Tuesday. He or she belongs inside a system with sacred backing. One interpretation is that this gave occupation a heavier social weight. If grain weaving, herding, brewing, brick making and record keeping all unfold under divine patronage, then work begins to feel less temporary and more like placement. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it helps explain why roles in ancient cities can seem so deeply embedded. Historians still argue whether temple institutions dominated every corner of economic life, or whether their importance varied by place and period. There's no full consensus, and that matters. Some cities' times and records make the temple look central enough to run half the visible universe. Others suggest a more mixed economy, with palaces, households and private arrangements all playing their part. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But even allowing for variation, what's broadly accepted is that major institutions mattered, and temples were among the most influential of them. Now picture the courtyards more closely. In one area, workers sort grain into measured containers. In another, women spin and weave textiles that will clothe labourers, officials, and perhaps the divine statues themselves. Near a shaded room, a brewer oversees vats that smell like sour bread and warm cereal, which is less glamorous than modern craft beer branding might lead you to hope. Off to one side, a clerk receives reports from field supervisors. Nothing in this scene looks like the modern fantasy of self-discovery. No one is taking a gap year to find themselves by the river. The river is busy, the grain is due, and the gods, at least in the city's imagination, are not known for accepting late submissions. And yet this is exactly why the system becomes meaningful. In a precarious world order is comforting. Flood and drought are always waiting. Canals silt up. Harvests fail. Raids happen. Disease moves faster than philosophy. So a temple that organises labour is doing more than exercising power. It may be embodying stability. One interpretation is that when institutions repeatedly turn chaos into food, cloth storage and ritual continuity, people begin to treat those institutions as natural. What if the smell of barley and bitumen day after day became the smell of your lifelong place in society? This is where sacred language quietly does its work. The temple is linked to a god, and the god is linked to the city's well-being. That connection can make social roles feel less like negotiated arrangements and more like participation in a cosmic household. A careful reading might suggest that the temple did not merely manage labour. It gave labour meaning through proximity to divine order. You bring grain, weave, cloth, stamp clay, or haul reeds, and all of it happens within a structure that says, this matters because the city matters, and the city matters because the gods sustain it. There is also a fringe idea floating at the edge of this picture. A fringe idea proposes that temple systems preserve memories of literal divine administration, as if the gods once organised humanity directly into functional groups, and the institutions below simply copied that celestial design. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the language of divine order can sound startlingly administrative. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less a claim about supernatural management and more an invitation to ask why ancient societies so often imagined heaven in bureaucratic terms. What if people built their sacred worlds to resemble the systems that controlled food work and survival on Earth? That question is more shrouded than it first appears. Humans frequently picture the universe in familiar shapes. Kings imagine cosmic kingship. Merchants imagine balances and exchanges. Scribes, one suspects, imagine the afterlife as a place with excellent archives and proper shelving. So perhaps temple households did not imitate the heavens so much as teach people what the heavens ought to look like. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is possible that large institutions shaped religious imagination just as much as religion justified institutions. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is this: temple households, organised goods and labour on a large scale. Writing served those systems, and repeated participation in them could make social roles feel fixed, meaningful, even inevitable. The mist is where we ask whether that sacred framing merely described the system or helped lock it into place. As you move deeper through the complex past cool jars and stacked tablets, and the endless human choreography of storage and duty, the idea becomes harder to ignore. A city that counts your work, feeds your household names, your function, and places all of it beneath divine care is doing more than employing you. It may be teaching you day by day to think of your role as part of the natural order itself. The further you move into this world of counted grain and organised labour, the more one figure begins to stand apart from the noise, and not because he is physically stronger or more glamorous. Quite the opposite. He is usually seated. He has dust on his fingers rather than mud on his calves. His tool is a cut reed. His material is wet clay, and his greatest power is that he can make speech stay put. In a city full of workers, carriers, brewers, herders, and weavers, the scribe occupies a narrow and unusual doorway. Most historians agree that literacy in early Mesopotamia belonged to only a small minority. Archaeology suggests scribal training was specialised, demanding, and closely linked to institutions. One interpretation is that writing did not simply record hierarchy, it may also have sharpened it. You can imagine the schoolroom though. Schoolroom makes it sound more cheerful than it probably feels to the child crouched over a clay tablet, trying not to disgrace himself before lunch. The room is warm already. Reed baskets lean against the wall. Practice tablets sit in stacks, some neatly done, some bearing the ancient educational mark of a student who absolutely guessed and hoped for the best. Most historians agree that scribal schools, often called edabas, in later descriptions trained boys from certain social backgrounds to master signs, lists, formulas, accounts and literary texts. The evidence we do have points to a long process of memorization and repetition. This is not a creative workshop where the teacher urges you to express your inner self. This is a place where your inner self is told to sit down and copy the signs correctly. And yet, for all its stiffness, the path matters enormously. A more cautious explanation could be that literacy became powerful precisely because it was difficult and restricted. If only a small number of people can read records, draft transactions, preserve hymns, interpret official language, and connect the spoken world to the written one, then those people become gatekeepers almost by default. One interpretation is that the scribe's role turns knowledge itself into a social boundary. That boundary does not always look dramatic. No one is standing at the city gate in a glittering cape shouting, "Halt, only the literate may pass." It is quieter than that. It lives in access, in training, in habit, in the difference between the person who can mark a tablet and the person whose name is merely marked on one. Historians still argue whether scribal education in different periods was broad enough to create meaningful mobility or narrow enough to preserve elite control. There's no full consensus, and the details shift over time. Some evidence suggests that becoming a scribe could offer advancement and prestige. Other evidence points to a more closed circle in which literacy mostly reinforced existing social layers. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, but what's broadly accepted is that literacy was not universal, and that alone makes the scribe's role special in ways that go beyond practical skill. Because writing does more than count grain, it shapes memory. The farmer can plant, the potter can fire jars, the weaver can finish cloth, but the scribe can decide which acts are recorded, which names are preserved, which obligations are fixed, and which stories are copied for the next generation. Archaeology suggests many surviving tablets are administrative, educational, or economic, but Mesopotamia also preserves myths, hymns, proverbs, royal inscriptions, and legal traditions. The evidence we do have points to a remarkable fact: those who learnt the signs stood near the machinery of continuity itself. A careful reading might suggest that the scribe was not simply another worker in the system. He was one of the few people who could make the system visible to itself. That kind of visibility carries social weight. If temples and palaces organise labour, scribes give those structures voice. If a worker receives rations, a scribe may record them. If a field is assessed, a scribe may note its output. If a hymn is performed, a scribe or trained tradition may preserve the words that link city order to divine will. One interpretation is that writing helps separate roles, not only by labour, but by awareness. Some people lived inside the system. Others also understood how the system described itself. That difference could feel enormous, even if it remained mostly unspoken. What if the boy learning wedge marks is already being sorted away from the field, hands beyond the wall? That question is part history and part mood, but it grows naturally from the evidence. The training itself is selective. The signs take time. The tablets require correction. The school discipline is famous enough in later texts to make modern homework complaints look almost elegant. There are school exercises, lexical lists, copied lines, and hints of stern teachers who probably regarded mercy as a dangerous innovation. You can almost hear a child sighing the oldest sigh in recorded education. He has not yet become a great official. He's just trying to keep his column straight and avoid humiliation before dinner. And still the role is already changing him. He learns not only signs, but categories. He learns how grain is counted, how titles are written, how goods are listed, how names are paired with duties. He learns the logic of order in its most literal form. A more cautious explanation could be that scribal education trained minds to think institutionally. It is possible that the school did not merely produce record keepers. It produced people comfortable with hierarchy, classification, and continuity. If so, then literacy does not just sit above social divisions, it helps maintain them. There is naturally a fringe idea waiting in the corner, like a person at a party who lowers their voice and claims to know what the tablets really mean. A fringe idea proposes that scribes preserved secret knowledge from divine beings who originally structured human society into fixed roles. This theory isn't widely accepted, and most of the evidence offered for it is highly speculative. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it reveals something interesting about modern fascination. People sense that writing has power, and they are tempted to imagine that the first great literate cultures must have been guarding more than invoices and hymns. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real wonder is not hidden revelation, but the plain fact that once writing enters society, power becomes easier to store? That is suggestive, not conclusive, but it fits the world around you. In an oral setting, much depends on memory performance and presence. In a written one, decisions can travel, commands can persist, records can outlast the people who made them. A scribe can bind a field labourer to an account, a temple servant to a ration, a merchant to an obligation. The clay hardens, and with it a version of reality hardens too. You begin to see why the scribe stands apart, even if his sandals are dusty, like everyone else's. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is that scribal training was specialized, literacy was restricted, and writing became central to administration and culture. The mist is the possibility that this narrow door changed more than careers. It may have changed how society understood who belonged where. So you linger outside the school and hear the low murmur of recitation through the doorway, the soft press of reeds into clay, the tiny sounds of a civilization teaching a few children how to make the world legible. Outside workers move through sun and dust. Inside signs are copied in ordered lines. And somewhere between those two spaces, one role begins to separate from the rest, not because the gods clearly announced it, but because the city itself keeps rewarding the people who know how to turn life into marks. No rain can wash away. Outside the school, the light feels harsher, as if the sun has decided that education is one thing, but field labour is where the real test begins. You move away from the cool wall and towards the open land beyond the denser city blocks, where canals thread through the plain, and the earth, when properly managed, becomes the difference between a thriving city and a collective nervous breakdown. Most historians agree that irrigation agriculture sustained Sumerian civilization. Archaeology suggests the cities of southern Mesopotamia depended on carefully maintained canal networks, seasonal labour, and constant attention to land and water. One interpretation is that in a world so dependent on coordinated farming, the role of the cultivator could feel both ordinary and deeply fated. You do not need a myth first to understand why farming matters here. The landscape explains it for you. Southern Mesopotamia is fertile, yes, but not effortlessly so. This is not a place where nature kindly does the work while people lounge under shade trees discussing personal fulfillment. Water has to be guided. Fields must be prepared. Silt must be managed. The canal that gives life can also flood badly or fail entirely. What's broadly accepted is that agriculture in this region required organisation on a significant scale. The evidence we do have points to grain production, especially barley as a cornerstone of the economy. If the canal system fails, everything above it begins to wobble, from rations to trade to temple offerings to the very confidence that the gods are still taking your city's calls. You walk along a field edge and the air changes. The city smell of smoke wool and baked clay gives way to damp soil, reeds, sweat, and the faint green sharpness of growing things. Workers move in loose lines with tools that look simple but carry the kind of wear that tells you generations of hands have held them the same way. Someone shouts across the water. Someone bends to clear a channel. Someone shoulders a basket and does not look impressed by the romance of history. And honestly, fair enough. Ancient farming is one of those things modern people admire from a safe distance, preferably after lunch. Most historians agree that farming households and labour teams formed the base beneath urban life. The evidence we do have points to fields attached to temples, palaces, and private families in different periods, with labour obligations varying by time and place. Historians still argue whether the workers in these systems experienced their tasks mainly as seasonal duty, institutional obligation, or household necessity. There is no full consensus, partly because ancient lives leave uneven traces, but what's broadly accepted is that food production was never casual. It demanded planning, cooperation and repetition on a scale large enough to shape society itself. And once again, the larger question returns. If so much depends on agriculture, then how does a culture explain the people who do it? One interpretation is that myths about divine order helped frame farming not merely as survival labour, but as part of a grand design. A careful reading might suggest that when Sumerian and later Mesopotamian texts described gods establishing order, assigning domains, and sustaining fertility, they create a world in which the cultivator's place is not accidental. The farmer may not appear in every line of sacred poetry as a heroic star, but he is essential to the pattern. That matters. A society that depends on grain may elevate agriculture in practice, even when status does not always follow effort, which, to be honest, feels painfully familiar. Civilization has long had a gift for depending on the very people it underthanks. You can imagine how this feels at the human level. The same family tends the same stretch of land year after year. The same canals need clearing. The same planting rhythms return. The same tools are repaired. The same grain fills the same storage paths back into the city. Over time, work becomes expectation. Expectation becomes identity. Identity begins to feel inherited. A more cautious explanation could be that no god had to visibly assign the role for it to seem permanent. The system itself, repeated across generations, may have done that quietly enough. What if each furrow in the mud looked like part of a much older script you never got to read? That image is poetic. Yes, but it grows out of something real. In a literate temple economy, someone records yield, rations and obligations. In the field, someone lives the bodily version of those records. One person writes the line, another walks it. That is not necessarily injustice in every case, but it is certainly distinction. And distinctions repeated long enough begin to feel natural. One interpretation is that sacred language helps smooth that feeling into acceptance. If the fields prosper under divine blessing, if festivals celebrate fertility, if kings boast of maintaining order and abundance, then agricultural labour may appear woven into a cosmic chain, rather than merely dragged along by necessity. There is also the temptation, of course, to wander further into mystery. A popular rumour claims that ancient creation stories preserve the memory of humanity being designed specifically as a labour force, with farming as one of the earliest assigned functions. This theory isn't widely accepted in any literal sense, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Mesopotamian myths do sometimes imagine humans created to relieve divine burdens, but reading that as a straightforward historical blueprint for career assignment goes much too far. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts may reflect cultural ideas about work and dependence more than actual supernatural staffing policy. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumour becomes emotionally revealing. Why does it resonate? Perhaps because farming feels so foundational that people instinctively place it near the beginning of human purpose. Before bureaucracy, before literature, before polished kingship, someone has to coax food from the land. A fringe idea proposes that this practical necessity later became mythologized as destiny. That theory remains debated, but it points to something useful. Human beings often explain essential labour by surrounding it with sacred meaning, not because that meaning can be proven, but because bare necessity is rarely satisfying on its own. And in the field, necessity is very bare indeed. Your calves are tight, your shoulders ache, the mud pulls at your sandals with the possessive affection of a place that would gladly keep one if you are careless. The sun climbs with a relentless confidence. Somewhere nearby, water slides through a canal cut by hands that are now dust. The continuity is almost unnerving. Generations come and go, but the field remains. The water must still be guided, the grain still planted. What if the true power of early social roles was not that they were loudly imposed, but that they returned every season until no one could imagine society without them? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is that irrigation farming sustained Sumerian cities, demanded organised labour, and anchored the economy beneath everything else. The mist is the possibility that myths and sacred order made this essential work feel pre-written, as if the cultivator's place had been traced long before any one person stepped into the mud. So you stand for a moment at the edge of the field and watch ripples move through the canal under a warm wind, reeds, bending tools, lifting and falling voices, carrying over the water. The city behind you may speak in tablets and hymns, but out here the meaning is plainer and older. Grain first, order second, or perhaps in this world the two have already become the same thing. The path back toward the city bends past workyards that smell of damp clay ash, heated metal, and the faint sour note of sweat settling into wool. After the open fields, the workshops feel enclosed and strangely intimate, full of small repeating sounds that together make a kind of industrial lullaby. A potter's wheel hums, a hammer taps metal in careful rhythm, a knife trims leather. Someone feeds a kiln and squints into the heat with the expression of a person who has not been appreciated nearly enough for maintaining civilization's bowls. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cities depended not only on farmers and officials, but on highly skilled artisans. Archaeology suggests that specialized crafts such as pottery, metallurgy, carpentry, leatherwork, stone carving, and textile production were fundamental to urban life. One interpretation is that the craft worker occupied a role that was practical on the surface, but could also gather a kind of sacred glow when skill itself seemed like a gift. You see that glow most clearly when raw material becomes form. A lump of clay turns beneath steady hands and rises into a jar, with a throat, a shoulder, a body, a purpose. Copper is heated, shaped, sharpened, polished. Wood is cut and joined into tools, doors, boxes, sledges and furniture that make daily life possible without ever asking for applause. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian society contained real specialization, and that some artisans worked within temple or palace systems, while others may have operated through households or smaller local arrangements, depending on place and period. The evidence we do have points to a world where technical knowledge mattered. Not everybody could do this work well, and everybody lived with the results of it. That matters socially. When a city depends on crafted goods, the people who make those goods become more than background figures. A more cautious explanation could be that specialization itself encourages identity to harden around skill. If you spend years shaping clay casting metal, preparing pigments, or carving seals, your work does not merely occupy your day. It trains your body, narrows your habits, links you to networks of supply and demand, and likely teaches the people around you to think of you in those terms as well. One interpretation is that the artisan's role becomes durable because expertise takes time. The wheel remembers your hands, the furnace teaches patience, the city learns to call you by what you can do. Most historians agree that some crafts in Mesopotamia were associated with prestige, while others were simply necessary and relentless. Fine metalwork carved stone cylinder seals, luxury goods, and temple furnishings could carry status, especially when attached to elite or sacred settings. Pottery, brick making, and tool production might be less glamorous, though not less essential. Civilization, as usual, has a talent for admiring the decorative lid, while forgetting the person who made the cooking pot underneath it. Still, the evidence suggests that craft knowledge could confer importance, particularly in complex urban settings where quality and consistency mattered. Historians still argue whether specialised artisans enjoyed broad social mobility or remained tightly bound to institutional and household demands. There's no full consensus, and the answer probably shifted depending on the craft, the city, and the period. Some workshops appear tied closely to major institutions. Others may have allowed more independence. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But what's broadly accepted is that artisans formed a recognisable layer within urban society, one that sat somewhere between brute labour and elite administration, creating the objects that held the whole system together. And because this is Mesopotamia, sacred meaning is never far away. Temples required vessels, statues, furnishings, tools, ornaments, building materials and ritual items. Palaces required prestige goods. Households required containers, clothing, implements and repairs. A careful reading might suggest that when artisans produced goods for divine or royal use, their skill gained symbolic weight beyond function. A pot is one thing. A vessel used in temple service is another. A carved object placed before a god does not suddenly cease to be made by human hands, but the context changes how the labour is seen. One interpretation is that craft roles were elevated by being linked to sacred spaces, making technical ability feel like participation in a larger order. What if a potter at the wheel felt like a quiet partner in a plan larger than kings? That may be too poetic to pin to a single tablet, but it captures something plausible about this world. In societies where sacred and practical life overlap, skilled making can take on more than economic value. The artisan is not just producing stuff. He may be helping materialize order itself. Temples need offerings arranged properly. Storehouses need containers. Priests need implements. Officials need seals. Builders need bricks in absurd quantities, which is another reminder that every glorious ziggurat begins with someone ankle deep in mud, thinking this had better be worth it. You watch a potter lift his hands and alter the shape of a vessel almost invisibly. The movement is practiced enough to look effortless, which usually means it is the opposite. Nearby, a metal worker leans over a controlled flame. The workshop air shifts between dust and heat. Children or apprentices move at the edges, carrying, watching, learning where skill lives. Over time, that learning becomes inheritance in the practical sense, even if not always in a legal one. Knowledge travels through repetition. Roles begin to stick, not just because institutions record them, but because techniques themselves take years to absorb. A more cautious explanation could be that craft identity formed through discipline long before anyone needed to call it destiny. Still, destiny is the sort of word people reach for when skill seems mysterious. A fringe idea proposes that certain ancient crafts were taught by divine beings or preserved from a lost sacred age in which human functions were first divided and assigned. This theory isn't widely accepted, and most surviving evidence supports human apprenticeship experimentation and institutional training rather than supernatural instruction manuals. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it shows how easily impressive skill attracts myth. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if people saw mastery and, unable to reduce it to mere habit, wrapped it in divine association? That impulse is deeply human. When a thing is difficult, essential and beautiful, communities often decide it must be more than ordinary. They give it patron gods, rituals, prestige and stories. In Mesopotamia, where divine order permeates city life, this could make the artisan's place feel larger than the workshop walls. Not necessarily freer, not necessarily richer, but more symbolically charged. The city may divide roles through need, but culture can crown those roles with meaning afterward. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is that Mesopotamian cities relied on specialised artisans. Craft knowledge was socially important, and institutional demand shaped workshop life. The mist is the possibility that sacred association made those roles feel divinely favoured, as though technical skill itself carried the faint shimmer of appointment. By now, the afternoon light slants through the workshop, opening, touching rows of finished pots, coils of fibre, stacked bricks, scraps of leather, half-shaped tools, and the bright, brief glint of worked metal, before dust softens it again. You begin to sense that division of labour in this world is not just about control from above. It is also about competence, repetition, and the slow dignity of knowing exactly how to turn stubborn material into something the city cannot live without. And that perhaps is how a role begins to feel larger than a task. Not because someone announced it with thunder, but because the wheel keeps turning, the kiln keeps burning, and the hands that know what to do become impossible to replace. By late afternoon, the workshop noise gives way to another rhythm, one softer at first, though no less important. It comes from courtyards and long rooms where fibre is sorted, thread is drawn, and looms stand upright, like patient wooden skeletons waiting to be clothed. The sound is steady, almost hypnotic. Threads tighten, weights knock lightly, hands move in repeated patterns, so practiced they barely seem to require thought, though of course they require years of it. Most historians agree that women played major roles in Mesopotamian textile production, and household labour and archaeology suggests that weaving was not a minor domestic hobby, but a major economic activity often tied to institutions on a very large scale. One interpretation is that this kind of labour helped define women's social roles in ways that felt practical, expected, and eventually natural. The first thing you notice is how much cloth a city needs. A city needs garments for workers, officials, and families. Temples need textiles. Trade needs textiles. Storage needs sacks. Ritual life needs dressed statues, hangings, and coverings. Wool must be cleaned, spun, dyed, measured, woven, and distributed. What's broadly accepted is that textile production in Mesopotamia could be extensive and highly organised, with women often forming a large part of that workforce. The evidence we do have points to both household weaving and an institutional textile labour, especially in temple or palace settings in some periods. This is not spare time stitching for the joy of rustic aesthetics. This is industry, and industry with aching shoulders. Most historians agree that women's work in Mesopotamia was varied, but textile production is one of the clearest areas where the records and archaeology let you glimpse scale. Administrative texts speak in quantities and allocations. Workers may appear in lists. Rations are counted. Wool is tracked. Finished cloth moves outward into a larger system. A more cautious explanation could be that because weaving was so essential and so repetitive, it became one of the clearest ways society learned to connect women with a specific kind of labour identity. Not every woman wove under the same conditions, not every household worked the same way, and class and status mattered greatly. But one interpretation is that the social imagination of labour often settled around patterns like these because they were visible, necessary, and repeated across generations. You step nearer and see the details. Fingers twist thread with calm efficiency. A loom weight knocks softly. A worker shifts posture and rolls her shoulders with the familiar look of someone whose body has long since stopped finding this charming. Nearby, a supervisor checks output or allocation. The room smells of wool, grease dust, warm brick, and human concentration. No grand speech is needed. The role announces itself through repetition, the same motions, the same hours, the same expectation that this work will be done because it must be. Historians still argue whether large institutional weaving systems offered some women economic standing and structure, or whether they mainly reveal constrained labour under strong institutional control. There's no full consensus, and the answer probably differs by place status and era. Some women in Mesopotamian society could hold property, engage in business, or act with a degree of legal agency depending on circumstance. Others lived under heavy limitations. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But what's broadly accepted is that gender-shaped labour expectations and textile work is one of the clearest examples of that shaping at scale. And yet the deeper question is not only economic, it is symbolic. A careful reading might suggest that when a society repeatedly links women to weaving household management, food preparation, and fertility-centred spaces, those roles can begin to feel woven into the order of life itself. That is not the same as saying every woman wanted the same life, or that ancient society operated with one single rulebook. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is possible that repeated labour patterns encourage broader assumptions about what women were for what they were best suited to and where their place was imagined to be. Over time, expectation can masquerade as nature with unnerving confidence. What if the loom's steady rhythm sounded like society deciding who you were allowed to become? That question is more melancholy than the tablets alone can confirm, but it belongs here because labour is not only material, it is emotional. It teaches timing, posture, endurance, and silence. It teaches what is praised and what is overlooked. In a city where cloth production matters enormously, the women who produce it may be economically central while remaining socially constrained. Civilization has always been capable of depending on someone completely while still calling their work ordinary. It is one of its least adorable habits. At the same time, it would be too simple to paint only one picture. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian women's lives varied significantly according to status, family position, and context. Elite women, priestesses, household managers, tavern keepers, and businesswomen appear in different kinds of evidence. Some held notable authority, some moved within legal and economic frameworks more flexibly than people sometimes assume. Historians still argue whether later summaries of Mesopotamian gender roles flatten a more complicated reality than the sources actually show. That debate matters because no large civilization can be reduced to one loom room, however symbolic. Still, loom rooms matter. Administrative systems count output. Institutions distribute rations. Roles become legible through lists and routine. One interpretation is that this legibility helped gendered labour feel fixed. The spinner spins, the weaver weaves, the steward records, the temple receives. Repeated often enough, the pattern begins to feel eternal, even when it is historically produced. A more cautious explanation could be that sacred and social language made gendered division seem part of cosmic balance, rather than the result of habit, necessity, and power. There is naturally a fringe idea drifting through the room like loose wool. A fringe idea proposes that Mesopotamian myths preserve memories of divine beings, assigning women and men fundamentally different social functions from the beginning, almost like a celestial blueprint for gendered society. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for any literal supernatural assignment is thin. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it reveals a real pattern in human storytelling. People often explain entrenched roles by pushing them back to the dawn of time. If something feels old enough, it starts to feel unquestionable. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not proof of divine division, but a deeply human urge to make social arrangements look ancient, natural, and therefore safe from challenge. That is suggestive, not conclusive, but it fits what you see. Women's work here is essential. It is skilled. It is organised. It is exhausting. It can also be underestimated, which means humanity has apparently been repeating itself for thousands of years with depressing consistency. Yet there is dignity in the room too. Thread becomes cloth under steady hands. Disorder becomes pattern. Raw fibre becomes something useful, warm, tradable and beautiful. Skill lives here even if prestige does not always follow it fairly. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is that women were deeply involved in textile and household economies, gender-shaped labour in major ways, and institutions often organised that work on a large scale. The mist is the possibility that this repetition made gendered roles feel woven into the very fabric of order, as if society itself had been threaded on a loom long before any one person touched the wool. As evening inches closer, the light warms and softens across the room. Threads glow briefly gold before dimming again. The weights tap their patient rhythm. Outside the city continues counting grain training, scribes firing pots and tending canals. Inside cloth grows line by line beneath hands that may not write the official story, but without which the city would be colder, poorer, and somehow less complete. And once again you feel that ancient lesson taking shape. A role becomes powerful not only when it is declared, but when it is repeated until everyone forgets it was ever arranged by human beings at all. Evening settles slowly over the city, not as silence, but as a change in tone. The harsher sounds soften. Shadows lengthen along the mud brick walls. Courtyards glow in the last red light, and high above the clustered roofs, the temple platform holds onto the sun a little longer, as if rank itself can delay darkness. You have spent the day moving through fields, workshops, schools and weaving rooms, watching how labour sorts itself into patterns. Now the pattern rises into something even more visible. Above workers, above artisans, above scribes, in their dusty corners, there stand kings, priests, overseers and officials. Most historians agree that Sumerian city-states were highly stratified societies. Archaeology suggests clear layers of status, authority and privilege, and one interpretation is that myths of divine order helped make those layers feel not merely practical but rightful. You can see hierarchy in architecture before anyone needs to explain it. The houses of ordinary people cluster low and tight, practical and inward-looking. Storage spaces and workyards serve necessity, but the monumental buildings, temples, administrative compounds, ceremonial spaces and the residences of powerful institutions rise differently. They claim space. They are built to be seen. What's broadly accepted is that early Mesopotamian cities expressed power physically through layout and construction. The evidence we do have points to centralised authority, organised labour and leadership tied closely to religious institutions. One interpretation is that a person walking these streets did not have to be told that society was layered. The city itself said so every time you looked up. Most historians agree that kingship in Mesopotamia was often presented as divinely sanctioned. Rulers did not generally describe themselves as random lucky men who happened to win an argument and then acquired several thousand employees. They were linked to gods, chosen by gods, beloved of gods, or established under divine favour. A more cautious explanation could be that this language served political legitimacy in a world where sacred order mattered deeply. If power appears blessed, it becomes harder to challenge, without also challenging the cosmic balance that supposedly supports it. That does not mean every person simply obeyed with cheerful devotion. Of course, human beings have always been extremely talented at grumbling under their breath. But it does mean authority could present itself as more than force. And once that happens, the social ladder begins to feel less like a temporary arrangement and more like part of the structure of reality. You pass an administrative courtyard where lower officials wait for instructions. A supervisor checks accounts. A messenger arrives dusty and impatient. Somewhere beyond a priest or ruler performs rituals that tie the city's fate to divine favour. The line between sacred and political power is not always neat. Historians still argue whether in certain periods temple leadership or palace leadership held the stronger hand, and the balance could shift over time and by city. There's no full consensus on every detail, which is only fair because ancient politics had no interest in making things convenient for future viewers trying to relax at bedtime. Still, what's broadly accepted is that authority clustered at the top and that ordinary labour supported it from below. The result is not just inequality, it is theatre. A ruler appears in inscriptions as the builder of walls, the maintainer of canals, the sponsor of temples, the favourite of the gods. Priests and high officials stand near sacred knowledge and in institutional control. Below them, administrators, scribes, craftsmen, labourers, and agricultural workers form descending layers of access and influence. The evidence we do have points to a society that knew very well who stood where. One interpretation is that the divine language wrapped around kingship and office helped transform social difference into moral or cosmic difference. A careful reading might suggest that if rulers are framed as guardians of order appointed by heaven, then hierarchy stops looking like a human choice and starts looking like a necessity. What if hierarchy felt less like a ladder you climbed and more like a wall already built around you? That question lands a little harder in the cooling evening when the day's work has shown you just how much life depends on repetition. If your father worked the field, if your mother wove, if the temple counted your household's rations, if the scribe wrote your obligations, and if the ruler spoke with divine backing, then the whole system could feel old long before you were born. A more cautious explanation could be that social roles seemed fixed because institutions, architecture records, and ritual all repeated the same message. The world has levels. Those levels are meaningful. Stay in yours, and the city continues breathing. That message is not unique to Mesopotamia, of course, but here it gains unusual durability because it is reinforced by both writing and religion. A royal inscription does not simply announce power, it preserves its preferred explanation. A temple ritual does not merely honour a god, it renews the bond between divine order and civic hierarchy. Together they create atmosphere, and atmosphere matters more than we sometimes admit. People live inside stories as much as under laws. The story here is that order descends from above, through gods, through rulers, through institutions, into fields and workshops and homes. There is, as always, a more speculative edge to this. A fringe idea proposes that ancient Mesopotamian hierarchy preserves the memory of literal divine rulers, who once divided humanity into classes according to function, keeping elites closest to sacred knowledge and ordinary workers locked into service below. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for a literal system imposed by non-human beings is very thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the idea becomes revealing in another way. Why do people keep imagining that rigid social order must come from somewhere more powerful than mere custom? Perhaps because custom, when repeated long enough, can feel almost supernatural in its grip. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not hidden overlords, not a secret ancient formula for modern class systems, but the simple human habit of sanctifying inequality once it becomes useful to those at the top. That is suggestive, not conclusive, and it should be handled carefully, yet it matches something broadly visible in many civilizations. When hierarchy stabilizes stories appear to explain why it is natural. In Sumerian city-states, those stories could draw on divine favor, sacred institutions, and the constant visible difference between monumental space and ordinary life. And still you should resist making it too rigid in your mind. Historians still argue whether social mobility, patronage, military service, institutional roles, or shifts in fortune allowed more movement within Mesopotamian society than the grand language of hierarchy might imply. There's no full consensus. Some people surely moved upward or sideways in ways the surviving records only partly capture. That matters because human societies are rarely as tidy as their official self-portraits. Even the best organised ancient city still contains ambition, luck, marriage alliances, debt trouble, family protection, bad harvests, and that one official who probably should not have been trusted with anything sharper than a spoon. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is that Sumerian city-states were stratified, authority was tied to divine language and architecture, and institutions made social rank highly visible. The mist is the possibility that myths of sacred order helped those layers feel inevitable, as if society itself had been stacked by hands older and higher than any human ruler. Now the sky deepens toward blue-black. Lamps appear in doorways. The upper structures of the city glow faintly in the last light, while workers drift home beneath them, carrying tools dusts and the weariness of useful bodies. Above the temple still catches the eye. Below the streets hold the many lives that sustain it. And in that simple vertical picture, high place and low place, sacred height and ordinary ground, you can feel how a civilization might teach people, without ever saying it too bluntly, that some were meant to stand above, while others were meant to hold everything up. By nightfall, the city begins to look different. Not because its structures change, but because darkness edits what you can see and leaves only what the lamps choose to reveal. Doorways glow, courtyards flicker. From somewhere beyond the temple precinct, you hear a chant rise and then dissolve into the warm dark like smoke. It is easier at night to imagine the gods close by, not necessarily because they are easier to prove, but because mystery always looks taller after sunset. And yet, if you step carefully through the evidence, something surprising appears. Many of the tablets that survive from Mesopotamia are not dramatic revelations about cosmic secrets. They are practical records, lists, counts, receipts, allocations. Most historians agree that a huge portion of cuneiform writing is administrative in character. Archaeology suggests that the oldest written cultures were deeply concerned with managing goods workers and institutions. One interpretation is that later readers, looking back at these tablets, through the haze of myth began to see the gods less as distant symbols and more as great administrators of the human world. That sounds almost funny at first, and perhaps it should. Heaven as bureaucracy is not the image most people order when they ask for ancient mystery. They want thunderstars, sacred mountains, and maybe a glowing doorway if the budget allows. What they get very often is barley tallies and labour rosters. But what's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian civilization linked divine order to practical order so tightly that the comparison is not as absurd as it seems. Temples managed resources, palaces managed people, scribes managed records, priests managed ritual sequence, kings managed authority through divine language. A more cautious explanation could be that the gods, as imagined in myth and ritual, reflected the same values that kept city life functioning: coordination, allocation, stability, rank, obligation. In other words, the universe begins to look a little like a very large office, only with better robes and more incense. You can see why the image would stick. Mesopotamian myths often describe assemblies of gods, divine decrees, assigned domains, and cosmic roles. One deity is linked to wisdom, another to storms, another to fertility, another to kingship, another to love and war in combinations that sound emotionally exhausting. Most historians agree that these divine portfolios reflect complex religious development over time, not a neat master plan drawn up in one afternoon. Historians still argue whether particular myths preserve older political realities, regional rivalries, theological synthesis, or ritual ideals. There is no full consensus, and that uncertainty matters. But one interpretation is that the divine world as told in stories offered a model of distributed power and assigned function that human society could recognize instantly. If heaven has departments, earth may begin to copy them. That is not a literal claim. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is possible that people in Mesopotamia imagined divine order in ways that mirrored the structures around them, and in turn, used those divine stories to make human structures feel more intelligible. This goes both ways. A city with officials, storehouses, rituals, labour teams, and ranked authority may imagine its gods as organised powers rather than vague cosmic fog. At the same time, once the gods are imagined that way, human systems can seem nobler, older, and more grounded than they really are. One interpretation is that divine administration made social function feel less invented and more discovered. That matters for the question we are following tonight. If the gods are not merely powerful but organising, then human roles begin to look like reflections of a higher pattern. The brewer, the herder, the weaver, the scribe, the ruler, the temple servant, each fits somewhere inside a larger arrangement. The evidence we do have points to a culture that loved classification enough to write it down constantly. Grain by amount, workers by group, goods by type, offerings by occasion. A careful reading might suggest that this habit of categorizing did not stop at the warehouse door. It could spill outward into how people imagined the world itself. What if the first great literate civilizations taught themselves to see existence as a ledger of places, duties, and domains? That image is a little severe, but it fits the mood of the tablets more often than modern fantasy would guess. When people today hear ancient gods, they often imagine chaos, spectacle wild forces breaking across the sky. Mesopotamian religion certainly had awe and danger in it, but the written record also gives us another flavour: order, procedure, repetition, sacred sequence. Temple timetables, one suspects, were not created by people who enjoyed improvisation. Somewhere in the deep past, a priest is almost certainly telling an assistant that this offering was supposed to arrive earlier and that divine favour, while vast, does not excuse sloppy scheduling. And now the strange part begins to feel less strange. A fringe idea proposes that these administrative patterns in both heaven and earth are memories of literal divine governance, as if ancient people once served supernatural rulers who divided tasks exactly as a well-run institution would. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. There is no clear tablet that simply states in plain language, non-human beings arrived and assigned permanent occupational roles to all future humanity. That leap belongs more to modern speculative imagination than to mainstream history. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it highlights something genuinely worth noticing. Why does the overlap between sacred order and administrative order feel so persistent? What if the story is pointing at something else, perhaps not literal? Celestial managers, but a society so deeply structured by institutions that it could not help imagining the divine through the same lens. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And one of the clearest clues is that practical record keeping and sacred imagination were not enemies in Mesopotamia. They lived side by side, sometimes in the same precinct, sometimes in the same hands. Most historians agree that surviving tablets overwhelmingly reflect real administrative needs, but one interpretation is that this very practicality helped ancient social roles feel permanent. Once categories are repeatedly written, copied and preserved, they gain a kind of cultural gravity. The role is no longer just lived, it is recorded. It becomes part of the visible order. A more cautious explanation could be that the gods in such a world function not as authors of every human role, but as the sacred horizon that makes the whole arrangement seem sensible. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is that Mesopotamian tablets are often administrative, that divine order and civic order were closely linked, and that categorization mattered deeply in both practice and belief. The mist is the possibility that later readers, ancient and modern alike, saw in those patterns a world where the gods themselves appeared as the ultimate organisers, assigning functions the way a city assigns tasks. Now the lamps burn steadier. The clay tablets in their stacks seem almost alive in the shifting light, each one holding some narrow slice of labour, delivery, offering, or duty. No single tablet tells the whole story, but together they create a mood that is hard to ignore. This is a civilization that writes order into matter. It presses function into clay. And once a culture learns to do that, it becomes very easy to imagine that all the roles beneath the stars, from the highest priest to the lowest carrier of reeds, were part of a design already waiting to be copied. The lamps burn lower as the night deepens and the city seems to exhale. The noise of trade fades. The courtyard's quiet. Dogs bark somewhere beyond the walls, then stop, as if they too have accepted that Mesopotamia has had a long enough day. You remain awake a little longer, though, because this is the hour when stories feel closest, when the practical world loosens its grip just enough for myth to lean in. And if there is one idea from ancient Mesopotamia that has echoed far beyond its own time, it is this: human beings were made to serve. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian creation myths sometimes describe humanity as created to take over labour from the gods. What's broadly accepted is that these stories belong to a larger religious tradition, shaped over time, and one interpretation is that they offered a grand explanation for why work duty and unequal burdens seemed built into the human condition from the start. This is where the clay grows especially interesting. In later Mesopotamian myth, especially in texts like Atrahasis and related traditions, humans are created after lesser divine beings become weary of toil. The details shift across versions and periods, and historians still argue whether these stories should be read mainly as theological reflection, social metaphor, political imagination, or all three at once. There is no full consensus, but the evidence we do have points to a striking pattern. Labour is not treated as a side issue. It is built into the origin story itself. Human life in these myths begins not with leisure, not with pure freedom, but with function. That alone is enough to make later readers sit up a little straighter in their beds and wonder what exactly the ancients thought they were saying about us. A more cautious explanation could be that these myths were never literal personnel manuals from heaven. They may instead reflect the world that produced them. In a society where large institutions depended on labour, where cities rose on coordinated effort, and where the burden of work was unequally distributed, a creation story about beings made for service would have felt both dramatic and familiar. One interpretation is that myth gave cosmic shape to daily reality. If people already lived in a world of assigned duties, then a story in which humanity itself is born into obligation would not feel absurd. It would feel strangely honest. You can almost sense why the story had staying power. Imagine sitting in lamplight while a trained voice recites a tale of divine dissatisfaction, heavenly burden, and the making of human beings from mixed materials fashioned to take on the labour that others no longer wish to perform. It is both majestic and blunt. Humanity enters the scene, and almost immediately there is work to do. No gentle orientation packet, no wellness seminar, no reassuring statement about work-life balance, just existence responsibility and the strong suggestion that the universe expects results by morning. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths should not be flattened into one single doctrine. They are layered, poetic, and tied to ritual kingship theology and the problems of real social life. Still, what's broadly accepted is that labour appears as a central element in several ancient narratives. That matters for the question of roles. If humanity itself is framed as created for service, then later divisions of labour can begin to feel like expansions of an original condition. A careful reading might suggest that social roles were easier to accept when myth had already placed work at the centre of what humans are for. That is not the same as saying the myths assign every occupation individually. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts do not list humanity into modern professional categories the way a career counsellor might, only with more incidents and fewer pamphlets. But one interpretation is that once creation itself is linked to labour, societies can more easily imagine that specific kinds of labour are natural extensions of that original purpose. The farmer tills because humans work. The weaver weaves because humans serve. The scribe records because order requires maintenance. The ruler commands because someone must manage the whole arrangement. The myth does not dictate each role in neat detail, but it can create the atmosphere in which role assignment feels deeply normal. What if the oldest job description on Earth began as a creation story whispered over lamplight? That question sounds dramatic, but it catches the mood exactly. The city you have walked through all day is already organised by labour hierarchy and sacred institutions. A myth that places work at the beginning of humanity does not create that structure out of thin air. More likely, it dignifies, it reflects it, and perhaps strengthens it. A more cautious explanation could be that such stories reassured people that their burdens were not random. They may have been heavy, but they were not meaningless. If the gods themselves built humanity with duty in mind, then work becomes more than necessity. It becomes purpose, even when purpose is exhausting. There is, of course, a more speculative reading that many modern audiences find irresistible. A fringe idea proposes that these creation stories preserve literal memory of advanced non-human beings engineering humans for specialised functions, dividing them into labour types that would echo down into all later civilizations. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for any direct, literal engineering is extremely thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The myths are poetic, symbolic, and shaped by long religious traditions. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the theory tells us something revealing about ourselves. People still hunger for an explanation of why life comes with obligation, why societies sort people so quickly, and why some roles seem to arrive already wrapped around us before we fully choose them. What if the story is pointing at something else, not ancient laboratories, not a secret technical blueprint buried under poetic language, but a culture using myth to make social reality feel ancient, sacred, and therefore easier to bear? That is suggestive, not conclusive, yet it fits the broader evidence. Human communities often respond to inequality and duty by telling stories that stretch those realities back to the beginning of time. If labour was there at the dawn, then labour today can feel less negotiable. If service belongs to creation, then social roles can appear less like arrangements and more like inheritances. Historians still argue whether these myths were heard mainly by elites performed in limited contexts or diffused more broadly through cultural memory and ritual. There's no full consensus, and that matters. A story's social power depends partly on who hears it and how often. But even if only certain versions circulated in specific settings, the idea is still powerful. The evidence we do have points to a world where cosmology and social life were deeply entangled. Myth did not float above reality. It helped explain it. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is that Mesopotamian creation stories often connect humanity with labour, and that these stories emerged within complex societies already organised by unequal work and sacred hierarchy. The mist is the possibility that this gave later generations a way to feel their roles were not just assigned by institutions, but woven into the human story from its first breath. Now the city lies mostly still beneath the stars, and the day's noises survive only in memory: the canal water, the wheel, the loom, the stylus, the shouted count at a storeroom door. In the quiet, the myth grows larger. Humans were made for service, the old stories say, in one form or another. Maybe not as an iron law, maybe not as a literal engineering report, but as a clue, a mood, a way of understanding why duty feels older than any one life. And in that soft night air with clay cooling in the dark, it becomes easy to imagine how an entire civilization might hear such a story and think, yes, that explains why the world already knew what to do with us before we ever arrived. Somewhere after midnight, when the city has gone quiet enough for even your own thoughts to sound like intruders, the question shifts. All evening, you have moved through a world that seems organised from top to bottom, from gods to rulers to scribes, to workers to fields. But now another possibility enters, softer and more unsettling. What if these roles were not always as fixed as they later seemed? What if some of the divisions that look permanent from a distance began as practical habits, flexible arrangements, or temporary needs, then slowly hardened into expectations, heavy enough to feel like fate? Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian society had recognizable social layers and occupational patterns, but the evidence we do have points to more complexity than a simple frozen cast picture. One interpretation is that divine language may have helped flexible roles become inherited expectations over time. That possibility matters because human societies often begin with solutions and end with systems. A canal needs clearing, so people organise labour. A temple needs records, so someone trains scribes. A household needs cloth, so weaving becomes regularised. A ruler needs loyal administrators, so offices gather prestige and stability. None of that requires a master blueprint at the beginning. A more cautious explanation could be that roles often become fixed, not because anyone designs them that way all at once, but because repetition slowly does the work that law or force alone cannot. The first generation solves a problem. The second generation copies the solution. By the third or fourth, someone starts calling it tradition, and suddenly no one remembers when it was negotiable. You can feel how this would happen in Mesopotamia. The institutions are durable. The temple persists. The palace persists. The fields demand the same rhythms year after year. The tablets record categories again and again. The child growing up in such a world sees not 1,000 possibilities, but a pattern already in motion. What's broadly accepted is that family background, institutional attachment, gender and social status all shaped opportunity in ancient Mesopotamia. Historians still argue whether mobility across roles was more common than the surviving texts make obvious, or whether the system was usually tighter than later romantic summaries allow. There is no full consensus. The records favour institutions, elites and recurring forms. Everyday improvisation is harder to catch in clay. Still, even the gaps tell you something. If the evidence were showing absolute rigidity at every turn, the debate would be much shorter and far less interesting. Instead, scholars continue to debate where the lines were firm and where they blurred. Some people may have moved through military service, patronage, marriage, apprenticeship, debt, or sheer luck. Some families may have improved their position over time. Some occupations may have been more open than others. A careful reading might suggest that the world was structured, yes, but not perfectly sealed. Yet structure does not need to be perfect to shape a life. It only needs to be strong enough that most people feel the boundaries long before they test them. What if a label first meant for convenience slowly turned into a cage with your name on it? That is the heart of tonight's darker possibility, though not a hopeless one. A role can begin as a task and become an identity, because institutions love continuity. Continuity keeps grain-moving rituals, stable taxes predictable, and leaders calmer than they would otherwise be. A city benefits when people already know where they fit. One interpretation is that divine language, sacred stories, and repeated records all help turn that convenience into something heavier. If the gods favour order, and if the city mirrors divine order, then fixed roles start to feel wise, rather than merely useful. That is suggestive, not conclusive, but it fits the broader pattern you have been walking through since dusk. It also fits something painfully familiar about human life. People often confuse the established with the natural. A practice lasts long enough and suddenly it feels inevitable. A job runs in families for generations, and eventually people speak as though the blood itself carries a preference for that work. A hierarchy survives a few centuries, and someone begins describing it as the only arrangement that ever made sense. Civilization has a remarkable ability to take a worn path and call it the shape of the earth. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian law collections, contracts, administrative texts and literary works reflect a world attentive to status distinctions. The evidence we do have points to different expectations for different categories of people, whether by class, household position, legal standing, or institutional role. But one interpretation is that these categories did not all arrive fully formed. They were maintained, adjusted, argued over, and reinforced through practice. The city is not a statue carved once. It is more like packed earth repeatedly stamped by the same sandals until the path becomes hard. You can imagine a father teaching a son how to manage irrigation tools, a mother teaching a daughter the motions of spinning and weaving, a senior scribe correcting a novice's shaky signs, an artisan passing along the exact touch needed to centre a pot on the wheel. None of this looks dramatic, it looks normal. That is precisely why it is powerful. Roles survive best when they no longer need fanfare. A more cautious explanation could be that inheritance of habit matters as much as inheritance of privilege. You learn where you belong by watching what the people around you do before sunrise and after supper. By the time anyone speaks it aloud, the lesson is already inside your hands. There is naturally a more speculative version of this idea. A popular rumour claims that ancient societies were deliberately locked into role systems by divine or semi-divine rulers who wanted humanity sorted into controllable types. This theory is not widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. There is no mainstream basis for reading Mesopotamian tablets as a straightforward manual for biological or spiritual role programming. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumour becomes useful in a different way. It captures the eerie feeling people get when social expectations seem older than memory. When a role grips generation after generation, it can feel as though someone somewhere must have designed it that way. What if the story is pointing at something else? Perhaps not a hidden designer, but a hidden process. Repetition, ritual, record keeping, family training, sacred justification, institutional convenience. These are ordinary forces, almost boring forces, and that may be exactly why they are so effective. Great systems do not always need dramatic conspiracies. Sometimes they only need enough people to wake each morning and do what was already expected of them. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues, and the clues suggest this much ancient Mesopotamian roles may have been both structured and negotiable in different ways at different times, but once sacred language and institutional habit settled over them, they could begin to feel far more permanent than they originally were. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now the air is cooler, somewhere water moves through a canal beyond the dark houses. A lamp has gone out, another still burns. The city sleeps inside its categories, its duties, its old arrangements pressed into clay and memory alike. And as you listen to the silence between distant footsteps, you begin to sense how a role does not have to be born as a prison to become one. It only has to be repeated, blessed, recorded, and inherited until the door quietly disappears. The night has grown deep enough that the city feels less like a place of walls and courtyards, and more like a breathing shape under the stars, its edges softened, its certainties briefly blurred. This is the hour when speculation becomes tempting, when every half-seen doorway looks like it might conceal a forgotten answer. And so it is no surprise that around Sumerian tablets especially, In the modern imagination, one idea keeps returning with stubborn energy. Perhaps humanity was not just organised by necessity, but deliberately sorted into enduring types by powers greater than itself. Most historians agree that no surviving Sumerian tablet plainly maps modern careers or personality categories onto humanity in a literal program. The evidence we do have points instead to myth, ritual administration and social order. One interpretation is that later readers, uneasy with how persistent roles can feel projected onto these old texts, a much sharper theory of ancient social engineering. This is where caution becomes especially important, because the story gets flashy very quickly if you let it. A fringe idea proposes that the gods of Mesopotamia were not symbolic beings within mythic thought, but literal advanced rulers who designed human society by assigning categories of labour status, temperament and function. In the most dramatic versions, farmers, builders, record keepers, leaders and servants all descend from original divisions imposed at the dawn of civilization. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It relies on speculative reading, modern projection, and a strong appetite for hidden systems. Yet it remains popular because it speaks to a real human feeling. Sometimes social roles do seem older than reason. They arrive early, tighten quickly, and survive with eerie persistence. That emotional truth makes the theory attractive, even when the historical basis is weak. What's broadly accepted is much simpler, and in its own way more interesting. Mesopotamian societies built large institutions. Those institutions required categorization. Writing helped preserve those categories. Myth helped explain why order mattered. A more cautious explanation could be that later readers mistook this layered cultural world for evidence of literal design because they were responding to the same puzzle the ancients faced. Why do societies sort people so efficiently? Why do some tasks gather prestige while others gather dust? Why do expectations cling to families and genders and classes with such confidence? If we treat the theory as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less a solution and more a mirror. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if these old tablets are not whispering about biological templates or celestial personnel charts, but about a very old habit of turning social arrangements into something that feels inevitable? That possibility is suggestive, not conclusive, but it fits the evidence better than a dramatic hidden blueprint. Human communities regularly explain their own structures by reaching upward or backward. Upward to heaven, where divine order gives current systems legitimacy. Backward to origins, where ancient beginnings make present roles feel natural. Once a culture says this arrangement is old sacred, or built into the world, it becomes much harder to ask who benefits from keeping it that way. You can sense how this would work in the Mesopotamian setting. The city is already full of repeated distinctions. The temple has its servants. The fields have their teams. The workshops have their specialists. The scribal schools train a few and exclude many. The ruler stands higher than the ordinary labourer physically, ritually, and politically. Most historians agree that these differences were real and substantial. Historians still argue whether any one explanation fully captures how people internalise them. But there's no full consensus, because ancient minds, like modern ones, probably held several explanations at once. Duty could be practical, inherited, sacred, burdensome, honourable and unjust, all in the same lifetime. Human beings are rarely tidy enough to live by one idea at a time. Still, a powerful society does not need perfect agreement to shape belief. It only needs repetition, enough symbolism, and enough institutions working in the same direction. A careful reading might suggest that ancient people could easily come to feel that social roles were more discovered than made. You are born into a household. You learn what that household does. The city's language confirms it. The temple blesses the order. The records preserve the distinctions. And before long, the role begins to feel older than your own choice. A more cautious explanation could be that the strongest social engineering is often the kind no one experiences as engineering at all. That idea is less thrilling than alien overseers with clay clipboards, but considerably more plausible. And somehow, it may be more unnerving too. If a literal god assigned your role, at least you could imagine arguing with the god or filing a formal complaint into the heavens and waiting several centuries for a response. But if the forces shaping your place are merely culture, habit, institution, and inherited belief, then they are everywhere and nowhere. They live in architecture, education, ritual, family, expectation law, and silence. They do not need one author. They only need enough people to keep repeating the pattern. There is also another reason the modern theory of ancient role design persists. It gives a dramatic origin to a quiet discomfort many people feel about contemporary life. Today's society still sorts people early and often, though with cleaner labels and much better stationery. Professional tracks, gendered expectations, class inheritance, educational gateways, personality branding, performance metrics, and the eternal suspicion that someone else got the handbook you never received. One interpretation is that modern readers are drawn to Mesopotamian role theories because they suspect the puzzle is much older than the corporate badge around their neck. What if your email signature is just a softer descendant of a clay category attached to a ration list? That question lands because it is both playful and sincere. We recognise ourselves in ancient classification systems, not because the details are identical, but because the instinct is familiar. Cities still need specialization. Institutions still value predictability. Cultures still reward some tasks more than others. Sacred language may have faded in some places, but moral language, professional language, and lifestyle language rush in to do similar work. They tell you what sort of person belongs in what sort of role. They make arrangement feel like identity. Most historians agree that we should not flatten Mesopotamian evidence into a one-to-one explanation of modern careers. That would be careless. The ancient world is not a costume version of the present, yet a careful reading might suggest that early civilizations show us something enduring about human order. Once we learn to categorize labour, we start categorizing people. Once we categorize people, we begin explaining those categories as meaningful. And once meaning settles around them, change becomes difficult. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is that no tablet clearly reveals a literal system of divine social engineering, and that Mesopotamian society is better understood through real institutions, myths, and economic structures. The mist is the possibility that the appeal of this fringe theory comes from a truth of another kind. Roles can feel so ancient, so persistent, and so strangely pre-written that people instinctively reach for grander explanations than history strictly requires. Now the city rests beneath the stars, its labour hidden for a few hours, though never truly absent. Somewhere in the darkness lie stacks of tablets with their counts and categories, their goods and names, their quiet insistence that order can be pressed into matter. You lie with that thought for a moment, not because it proves anything, but because it raises a question that ancient clay still knows how to ask. If no god literally designed our roles, why do they so often feel as if someone did? Toward the hour just before dawn, when the darkness is no longer deep but still refuses to leave, your thoughts drift forward. The city around you is ancient, yes, but the patterns inside it feel uncomfortably fresh. Titles, duties, ranks, specializations, approved paths, narrow doors, inherited expectations. The mud brick walls are old. The instinct behind them is not. Most historians agree that early Mesopotamian administrations depended on organizing people by task, skill and status. Archaeology suggests that complex urban life required categories sturdy enough to manage labour, storage, production, and authority. One interpretation is that the same mental habit once formed echoes far beyond Sumer itself. The names change, the clothes improve, the paperwork becomes digital and somehow still annoying, but the urge to sort human beings into roles remains. That is one reason these tablets still feel alive. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamia did not invent every later social structure, nor did it hand modern civilization a secret handbook titled How to Make Everyone Fill Out Forms Forever. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It would be misleading to claim a straight line from Sumerian storehouses to your current inbox, however spiritually similar they may feel on a Monday morning. But a careful reading might suggest that some of the most enduring habits of organised life are already visible there. Count the goods, track the workers, distinguish the tasks, rank the offices, attach people to institutions, preserve the categories. Once a civilization learns to do this well, it gains stability, memory and control all at once. And those things travel. You do not need direct historical inheritance in every detail to notice the resemblance. Human societies facing similar problems often produce similar solutions. Cities become larger, resources need managing, authority seeks legibility, labour needs coordination, specialised knowledge becomes valuable, education becomes a gate. Prestige clusters around some roles while other roles hold the floor up from underneath. Most historians agree that these dynamics appear in many civilizations, not only in Mesopotamia. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamia's specific institutions should be seen as foundational models or simply as among the earliest visible examples of broader human tendencies. There's no full consensus and probably never will be. But what's broadly accepted is that once urban complexity arrives, categorization becomes one of its favourite tools. You can feel that continuity most strongly in the language of function. Ancient tablets speak in workers' fields, rations, outputs, offices and obligations. Modern life dresses the same instinct in friendlier fabric. Teams, departments, certifications, performance reviews, career ladders, strategic alignment. The ancient version smells like clay and wool. The modern version smells like printer toner and overstated optimism. One interpretation is that the emotional structure is not entirely different. People still want to know where they belong, what they are for, whether their work matters, whether their title reflects their worth, and whether someone else quietly made those choices long before they arrived. What if your email signature is just a cleaner version of a clay tag tied to a basket of grain? That is a joke, but only partly. Categories do not merely describe labour. They shape identity. The person who spends years inside a role often begins to wear it inwardly. This is true in any age. The field hand's back learns the rhythm of irrigation. The scribe's hand learns the pressure of the stylus. The weaver's shoulders learn the loom. The manager, ancient or modern, learns the art of looking busy while standing near other people's effort. Civilization keeps refining the same magic trick. It turns function into personality and then pretends that was inevitable. A more cautious explanation could be that role identity persists because it solves emotional problems as well as administrative ones. Uncertainty is exhausting. Freedom in large doses can be frightening. A city full of people who do not know where they fit is difficult to govern, and perhaps difficult to be. One interpretation is that cultures repeatedly sanctify or moralize roles because sorted lives feel safer than shapeless ones. In Mesopotamia, that sanctification may have come through divine order. In later worlds, it may come through law professionalism, class ideals, family pride, or the noble modern religion of being extremely busy. Most historians agree that ancient social categories should not be romanticised as more meaningful than they were. Hard labour remained hard labour. Constraint remained constraint. Being told your place in the universe does not necessarily make your knees hurt less. Yet the evidence we do have points to something powerful. When a role is tied to the well-being of the whole city, it can acquire a seriousness that outlasts the specific system that produced it. A farmer feeds more than a household. A weaver clothes more than a family. A scribe preserves more than a transaction. A ruler claims to embody more than himself. That seriousness is one reason role structures survive. They borrow moral weight from necessity. There is also naturally a speculative edge that modern readers cannot resist. A fringe idea proposes that the persistence of human social roles across millennia is evidence that an ancient template was laid down early, perhaps remembered dimly in Mesopotamian texts, and then repeated in civilization after civilization. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for a single primeval blueprint is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the idea becomes interesting as metaphor. What if the ancient template is not a literal design, but a recurring human response to complexity? Build the city, divide the labour, explain the divisions, teach them to children, repeat until structure feels like nature. What if the story is pointing at something else? Perhaps the real echo from Sumer is not one exact system of roles, but the ancient discovery that people can be made easier to manage when function and identity are braided together. That is suggestive, not conclusive. Yet it would explain why later societies, including our own, so often sound as though they are describing destiny when they are really describing institutional convenience. And to be fair, institutional convenience has always had excellent public relations. The city around you begins to lighten at the edges now. Rooflines sharpen. Somewhere a rooster or some morally equivalent creature decides the night has lasted long enough. The air is cooler for the moment, carrying dust water and the faint memory of smoke. You think back through the roles you have seen: farmer, artisan, weaver, scribe, priest, ruler, labourer, official. Distinct, uneven, interdependent. Ancient, yes, but not dead. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is that Mesopotamian administrations relied on classification, specialization, and institutional roles, and that these patterns resemble broader tendencies found again and again in organized societies. The mist is the possibility that what still haunts us is not any one tablet's secret, but the deeper recognition that once humans discover how useful roles are, they rarely stop building worlds around them. So as the first grey of morning settles over the city, you begin to understand why ancient clay still feels oddly personal. It is not because the tablets predicted your exact job title or your suspiciously urgent calendar invite at 3 p.m. It is because they belong to one of the earliest worlds we can still hear clearly, and that world already knew something we keep relearning. The moment people start building civilization together, they also start deciding who gets to be what. Morning returns gently, not with fanfare, but with the slow reappearance of edges. Rooflines sharpen, courtyard doors open. The canal catches a pale stripe of light. Somewhere a worker coughs, somewhere a jar scrapes stone, and somewhere a scribe is already preparing to spend another day making sure other people's lives fit into neat marks. After walking through temples, schools, fields, workshops, loom rooms, myths and hierarchies, you arrive at a quieter question, perhaps the quietest and most human one of all. Why do people so often accept the roles given to them even when those roles are heavy, narrow or unequal? Most historians agree that Sumerian religion and economy were deeply entangled, and the evidence we do have points to a society where labour and status were embedded in powerful institutions. One interpretation is that people learned to see their role as meaningful because uncertainty is exhausting. What if the real division of humanity was never imposed by gods alone, but embraced, at least partly for the comfort of order? That possibility is less dramatic than divine social engineering, but much more intimate. You can imagine the appeal of order in a world like this. Floods threaten, crops fail, illness comes without warning, enemies raid, children need feeding. The city itself survives only if countless tasks are done at the right time by the right hands in the right sequence. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian life could be precarious, especially for ordinary workers whose security depended on harvests, institutions, and social ties. A more cautious explanation could be that in such a world, knowing your place had practical emotional value. If your role is clear, your duties known, your path marked by those before you, then at least one kind of uncertainty has been removed. That does not make the system fair. It makes it livable. Human beings are often willing to endure constraint in exchange for predictability. This is not unique to Mesopotamia. It may be one of the oldest bargains in social life. The farmer may not choose the field freely, but he knows what the field asks of him. The weaver may not design a horizon, but the loom gives shape to the day. The scribe may inherit pressure along with privilege, yet he too lives inside a script already written. One interpretation is that roles persist not only because elites enforce them, but because ordinary people also find within them rhythm, identity, and a way to quiet the terrifying openness of not knowing who they are supposed to be. That is not a heroic thought, perhaps, but it is a tender one. A careful reading might suggest that meaning itself is part of the machinery. Sacred language does not merely justify order from above. It can also soothe from within. If your labour belongs to a world watched by gods, then suffering may feel less random. If your task supports temple, household, city, and field, then your exhaustion is tied to something beyond private survival. Most historians agree that religion in Mesopotamia was not a side decoration to life. It was woven through daily existence, public ritual, and political authority. One interpretation is that people accepted roles more easily when those roles were made intelligible by a sacred story, not necessarily because they were fooled, but because the stories help humans bear repetition. Historians still argue whether ordinary people internalized elite religious frameworks as deeply as formal texts might suggest, or whether they moved through life with more practical, local, and mixed understandings than official language implies. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is important. A hymn copied in a schoolroom does not tell you exactly what a tired fieldworker thought after sunset. A temple inscription cannot fully capture the private mood of a woman at a loom or a potter by a kiln. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But what's broadly accepted is that public religion and daily economy overlapped enough that people could hardly avoid seeing labour through the language of order. And perhaps many did more than see it. Perhaps they leaned on it. What if the real comfort of civilization is not freedom, but explanation? That question lands softly but heavily. To live without explanation is tiring. To work without meaning is harder still. One interpretation is that ancient people, like modern people, often accepted roles because roles answered questions. Who are you? What are you for? Where do you belong? What must you do tomorrow morning? The system may answer harshly, but at least it answers. A more cautious explanation could be that the acceptance of social roles comes partly from psychological need, not just political pressure. The city gives you a place, and in return you help the city continue. That exchange can feel less like surrender and more like belonging, even when belonging has limits. There is a small irony here, of course. People may accept roles because roles reduce anxiety, yet the roles themselves can produce new kinds of suffering. The farmer worries about harvests. The scribe worries about errors. The artisan worries about supply, demand, and quality. The woman in an institutional weaving room worries about output rations and fatigue. The ruler worries about legitimacy and revolt, though perhaps with slightly nicer sandals. Civilization does not remove pressure. It redistributes it with remarkable creativity. Still, a defined burden can feel easier to carry than a shapeless one. at least you know which tool to pick up. A fringe idea proposes that the human desire for defined roles exists because ancient divine structures permanently imprinted social categories onto the species, leaving us to repeat them unconsciously across time. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for any such literal imprint is extremely thin. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it reveals something emotionally true. People often feel that their social world is somehow already there before they arrive waiting to receive them. Ancient myths dramatize that feeling. Institutions preserve it. Families pass it on. What if the sense of being assigned is sometimes less about gods than about the crushing continuity of culture? What if the story is pointing at something else, not supernatural role division, but the comforting seduction of structure itself? That is suggestive, not conclusive, yet it explains why systems survive even when they are imperfect. People criticize them, grumble within them, resist them at times, and still rely on them. You complain about the temple ration system, but you also need the ration. You resent the hierarchy, but you also understand where you stand inside it. You might dream of a wider life, yet the known path still has a strange mercy to it. In this sense, sacred order may have functioned not only as ideology, but as emotional architecture. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies were too varied and long-lasting for any single explanation to cover every person's motives. That matters. Some people obey because they believe, some because they must, some because alternatives are dangerous, some because family duty is stronger than private desire, some because routine can be comforting in a violent and uncertain world. Historians still argue whether acceptance, adaptation, and resistance can be meaningfully separated in ancient societies where evidence comes mostly from institutions. There is no full consensus. Human interior life almost never survives neatly in clay, and yet the clues remain. Repeated labour, sacred framing, institutional dependency, family teaching, and visible hierarchy all shape not only behaviour but imagination. Over time, it becomes easier to think not merely this is what I do, but this is what people like me are for. That shift may be one of the most powerful in all social history. It is where task becomes identity, and identity becomes destiny, or something close enough to destiny to stop arguing with before dawn. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is that Mesopotamian religion and economy reinforced one another, and that social roles were sustained by institutions, repetition, and meaning. The mist is the possibility that people embraced those roles, not only because power demanded it, but because order itself offered relief from uncertainty. Now the city is fully waking again. Doors open, sandals scrape, water jars move, smoke rises. No trumpet sounds, no voice from heaven declares the assignments, and yet the day organises itself with astonishing speed. That may be the strangest thing of all. The roles do not always need to be imposed loudly once they have been accepted quietly, and as you stand in the returning light, with the canal whispering beside the fields, and the temple walls catching the sun, you begin to suspect that the deepest mystery in these old tablets is not who divided humanity, but why people so often found comfort in the division once it was there. The sun is up again now, pale at first, and then steadily brighter, brushing the tops of walls, the reed beds, the edges of doorways, and the shoulders of people already walking where they walked yesterday. The city has resumed itself with the quiet confidence of a machine made not of gears, but of habit. Grain will be measured, water will be guided, wool will be sorted, clay will be marked, orders will descend, labour will rise to meet them. After everything you have seen, the great mystery no longer feels like a single hidden tablet waiting to be found beneath the sand. It feels smaller and larger at once. Most historians agree that in ancient Mesopotamia, labour, belief and status were tightly bound together through institutions, myths and practical necessity. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that made social roles visible, durable and meaningful. One interpretation is that the tablets preserve not a secret revelation about fixed human types, but a very old human tendency to sanctify structure once it becomes useful. And if that is true, it may be enough. You do not need a literal divine assignment chart to understand how powerful this world was. You have walked through a city where the temple organises goods and duty, where the scribe turns life into categories, where the farmer keeps the whole system fed, where the artisan shapes matter into necessity, where women's labour anchors the textile economy, where rulers speak in the language of heaven, and where myths place work near the centre of what humans are for. What's broadly accepted is that these elements belong to real ancient societies, not fantasies. A more cautious explanation could be that when all these forces overlap long enough, social roles begin to feel older than anyone living inside them. Not eternal, perhaps, but established enough to borrow the emotional weight of eternity. That is one reason Sumerian tablets continue to fascinate people. They do not merely show us ancient work, they show us ancient explanation. A careful reading might suggest that the deepest role of myth was not to hide reality but to help people endure it. If the city is unequal, myth explains why order matters. If labour is relentless, myth explains why service belongs to creation. If hierarchy is visible everywhere, sacred language teaches that visibility to feel meaningful rather than arbitrary. Historians still argue whether these stories reinforce social systems as much as later readers sometimes assume, and there is no full consensus. But what's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian thought did not separate practical survival from cosmic order the way modern habits sometimes do. That union is the real clue. What if the oldest civilizations did not divide humanity into roles because gods literally commanded it, but because organised life demanded categories, and human imagination could not leave those categories bare? What if the role of religion, ritual and myth was to place warm meaning around cold necessity? That possibility is suggestive, not conclusive, yet it makes sense of the world you have been walking through all night. People must be sorted somehow in a large city. Labour must be coordinated. Authority must justify itself. Identity must feel stable enough to carry the strain of repetition. And once those needs take shape, stories rise to meet them. A fringe idea still proposes that ancient Mesopotamian texts preserve memories of literal divine beings who engineered humanity into types that survive in altered form even today. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It leaps beyond the tablets more often than it reads them carefully. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, its popularity becomes understandable. The feeling it answers is real. Many people still sense that their place in society arrives partly pre-written, that some paths are blessed, others burdened, and most of us step into structures older than our own choices. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not an ancient hidden program, but the enduring human experience of entering a world already arranged. That may be the quiet truth resting beneath all the clay dust. The tablets do not have to reveal a single hidden truth to remain profound. Sometimes they reveal something more human than that. They show how early people grappled with a question we still ask in newer clothes. Why do some people rule and others serve? Why do certain tasks earn honour while others earn only necessity? Why do roles cling so tightly once established? Why does society so often turn arrangement into destiny? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clues suggest that once humanity learned how useful roles could be, it also learned how to bless them, narrate them, and pass them down until they felt natural. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is this ancient Mesopotamian cities depended on specialized labor, institutional power, sacred framing, and visible social layers. The mist is the possibility that these tablets preserve the emotional birth of a pattern. Still with us now, the pattern of turning social structure into something that feels as though it came from beyond us. And now as the morning settles and the city brightens fully, you can let the edges soften. You can let the tablets return to their shelves of dust and silence. You can let the temple walls stand quietly in the warm light, no longer towering, only present. You can let the canal move at its own patient pace, carrying reflections of reeds and sky. You can let the farmer walk into the field, the weaver lift the thread, the scribe lower the reed stylus, the potter touch the wheel, each one small beneath the day and yet essential to it. You can let the old questions remain old questions, not solved, not sharpened, just held. Because perhaps the calmest answer is that human beings have always searched for order, and once they found a pattern that kept the city alive, they wrapped it in meaning so it would be easier to bear. Perhaps that is why these ancient worlds still feel near. Not because they predicted us exactly, but because they already knew the comfort and the cost of being given a place. So the light grows warmer, the sounds of labour fade into distance, the clay cools, the dust settles, and you for a moment do not have to take up any role at all. You can simply rest beside the river of time, listening to the soft hum of a civilization that once pressed its questions into earth and left them there for us to wander over gently. Let the walls blur, let the voices soften, let the categories loosen, let the city drift a little farther away now into morning haze, into memory, into that quiet place where history stops demanding answers and begins offering only atmosphere. And as the last image fades, there is nothing left to solve tonight. Only the faint glimmer of sun on water, the hush of reeds in a warm breeze, and the strange comfort of knowing that even the oldest questions can be laid down softly in the end.